Hey guys, so I created a little mini lesson to review the empires of Acadia and Babylon. So we're going to talk about the first empires of Mesopotamia, or the first empires actually in the world, and those originated in Mesopotamia. And they are called the Akkadian Empire and the Babylonian Empire. And we're going to talk about their rulers. Okay, so it started with Sargon and Hammurabi. So before we get into about the empires and about their rulers, we're going to talk a little bit about the empire. And you need to know this word because we're going to review it many, many times throughout the course of this year in talking about some of the other civilizations. Okay, so an empire is a group of many lands under one ruler. So one ruler is going to take over many other lands other than their own. Okay, we know that Mesopotamia initially or originally is set up into little city states. So basically you had your city and each one had its own government. Well, that begins to change as the city states kind of fight with one another. And then you find that there is one ruler that starts to kind of have a little bit more power, and they're going to take over the other city states. Obviously, that's a good thing. It's beneficial because it's going to strengthen your economy. It's going to strengthen the resources that you have and the amount of money and the amount of power that you have within the world. So we'll see that over time and throughout history, but these are the first ones and they originated in Mesopotamia. So what I have here are the four empires of Mesopotamia. We're only going to talk about the first two today, okay, and then we'll get into the other two later on, okay, but we are talking about the Akkadian Empire and the Babylonian Empire. So I'm going to just kind of quickly put them in order for you. So the Akkadian is the first, the Babylonian is the second, and the Assyrian, that's how you pronounce it, Assyrian, is the third. And then we go into Neo-Babylonian empires, okay? And they had some other names as well, which we'll get into in our next lesson. Okay, so just go ahead and move on. I want to talk a little bit about this graphic that I have here because it is broken up into a timeline, and we really haven't formally gone over timelines, but I do want to share with you, I'm just going to move my face, that timelines are read from left to right. So we did talk about that once before, but I want to reiterate that. That means restate it so that this way you can kind of bring that to memory. So we always are going to start with the dates over to the left, and then those being the most recent and the earliest, and then the dates over to the right are going to be the latest in history, okay? I have some things popping up. I didn't really want that to happen, so just ignore what has popped up at this point. All right, so timelines are read, like we said, from left to right, okay? And I want you to understand that BCE is earlier than AD. So on this specific timeline, you really only see BCE, and BCE actually stands for before the Common Era. Sometimes you might see it written as BC, which means before Christ. But because not everybody believes in Jesus Christ, the more politically correct way to not offend anybody is to just say BCE. So that's why you see that on some timelines, but they mean the same thing. So BC and BCE mean the same exact thing. Okay. Now the thing with BC dates or BCE dates is that they're read like negative numbers, which means that the greater the number, the earlier the date. Okay, so you can see as we look at this timeline, we have 2,500, then it goes to 2,000, 1,500, 1,000, and 500. So obviously you see them going down. So normally you would think that the numbers over to the right would be the earliest, but that is not the case because we always read from left to right. So BCE is a little bit backwards, or BC dates are different from what we would see typically in modern times, because we have AD dates where we don't put an AD at it. We just say we're in the year 2020, and the year before is the year 2019, and the next year will be 2021. So we go consecutive order. This is almost like negative numbers if you're dealing with like negative degrees on a thermometer and things like that. And you probably deal with negative numbers also in math. So you should be somewhat familiar with that. So anyway, just keep in mind that we're reading from left to right. Okay, so the other thing that you need to see is that they gave you a picture, an image, so you can see what the empire took over on this little graphic. So you see that it says the Akkadian Empire, and it says about 2,300 to about 2,100 BCE. So that is indicated here on the timeline, and there's a little line going from that graphic. You also have another visual or another graphic here, and they're showing the Babylonian Empire, and that's going to be from about 1,700, or I should say 1,792 to about 1,590 Okay, the dates are not that important. I don't expect you to memorize them, but I do expect you to understand that the Akkadian Empire came first, followed by the Babylonian Empire. Okay, and you can clearly see that on the timeline if you take a look at those lines that are showing where that empire originated on the timeline. Okay, again, reading from left to right. So the Akkadian Empire is basically controlled by Sargon of Akkad. Okay, so Akkad was a city-state, and he decided to take over some of the other city-states, which means that he sets up the first empire. So Sargon is really known for setting up the world's first empire by taking over those other city-states. And he establishes what we call the Akkadian Empire because he was from Akkad. He conquers much of Mesopotamia, which you can see in this graphic here. If you compare the colors, or at least compare the purple to the green in the Babylonian Empire, you can see that he controlled a little bit more than the Babylonian Empire did. And if you even go over to here, to the other ones, the Assyrian Empire, you can see the Assyrian Empire really controlled a great deal. And then later on, they didn't control as much, okay? That does happen throughout history where you get empires that get really, really big, and then the ones that follow are kind of small because they kind of learn that it's really difficult to take care of and control large empires like that. We'll see that when we talk about the Roman Empire, which is one of the biggest in history. Okay, so he conquers much of Mesopotamia, and this occurs in 2340 BC. You can see that they kind of guesstimate that here, but in your textbook, this is what it would say. All right, so those dates sometimes can vary. That's why I don't expect you to remember the exact date, okay? So his empire lasts for about more than 200 years, which is pretty significant. It's a long time, okay? And it's important to note, too, that he's obviously not the ruler for 200 years because nobody could live that long. So he obviously passes down that rule to his sons because we've talked about what happens with kings, all right? And they are considered the Akkadian. Followed by Sargon's empire, we see the Babylonian Empire. Okay, so Babylon was actually a city-state in Mesopotamia, and the leader of this Babylonian Empire is going to become Hammurabi. So Hammurabi begins conquering land to the north and the south of Babylon. So Babylon is kind of in this area. I'm going to show you another map on the next slide. And you can, when we see that, you'll see that that's where that area is that he controls. So it's a little bit smaller than the Akkadian Empire, but he did create the Babylonian Empire. So the other thing that you will want to know, obviously, like I said, he conquered the lands to the north and the south of Babylon, creating Babylonia. So if you take a look, here's Babylon, right? And you can see that he conquered some of the lands here to the south, okay? Which is really important because we know that that's where most of the fertile area was, as opposed to the north. The north wasn't as fertile. So obviously he would want to take over that region because it's going to have a lot of resources, good, rich, fertile soil, and you can do a lot of things with that. So he establishes what we call Babylonia. What he is also best known for, not only creating an empire, but his code of law, which our laws today are actually based on some of his laws. We can see that they are pretty harsh because we did do a little bit of reading about it, and we understood that a lot of times if you did something wrong, you were killed or you were harmed in some way. So he did that and had very strict consequences for his laws because he didn't want people to break them. So it kind of deterred people and kept order. But that's what he's known for. It was called Hammurabi's Code of Law. And then in 1750, that's when he started to write these laws. He wrote about 282 laws, and he did that to keep order and ensure the safety of the citizens within his empire. The laws covered things like they would today, like crimes in farming and business, marriage and family issues, divorce, things like that. Things within the family, we did see one that said like the father, if the son had hit the father, his hand would be cut off. So you could see that they are pretty strict. And a lot of times if you did something wrong, like you stole something, especially if it was for somebody of the upper class and the nobles or the kings or the priests, the penalty was death. But you also had to prove that actually happened. So you had to have witnesses. There was like a court system that he established as well, but it basically always had to be provided based on evidence. So really, really important that happened. And if that did not occur, obviously we would show that person was innocent and they would go free. But if you were wrongfully accusing somebody, you would be punished as well. And that penalty oftentimes resulted in death. So people pretty much kept in line under this empire, but it was the first code of law, which was super important. Okay, so that's pretty much all I wanted to share with you about Hammurabi and Sargon. So you had a note page that I'm giving you. The questions that are on there, you can obviously go back to this presentation and pause and fill in anything that you think that you need. I'm also providing for those of you that are online the actual slides, so you can actually copy and paste from the slides in order to put the information into your questions, or I should say your note sheet. Okay? All right, I hope you enjoyed, and if you have any questions, obviously feel free to ask.